Hello and welcome to the Work.Rest.Pray podcast. This episode is a recording of a talk and question and answer session that I was invited to do at St Stephen's Church in Saltash in Cornwall.
So, special guest, we've got Richard Frost with us this evening. Known Richard for a few years,
Yes.
as I've been going to Southwest Ministry Training College. Richard's a chaplain there, so we've crossed paths at most meets and said hello, etc. Now I've got you here. So, over to you to tell us whatever you'd like to talk about.
I will. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Steve, for your welcome and inviting me to be with you, and thank you all for coming along as well. It's good to be with you. Steve invited me to talk about my personal journey of faith and how that interacts with this thing that we call life. So partly in general, but also in relation to the work that I used to do and as a lay minister and an author. And it's in that latter role that I'm going to structure the session that we're going to have, beginning with a prologue. So as I was preparing this, I realised that this was the first time in a very long time, if indeed ever, that I've been asked to talk about me. I'm quite used to talking about the work that I did, about preaching, about talking about the books that I write, but actually talking about me is something I rarely do in many respects. So it's been interesting wondering, well, what do I say? What do I not say? Should I tell you particular things both with the advantage that you'll probably never see me again, nor I you, and also perhaps a cautiousness about, well, why should I say particular things to people I don't know and who don't know me? Indeed, will you even be interested? And I've had one gentleman already who said that he's welcoming the opportunity to go to sleep later on. And it is simply talking about myself one big ego trip. Having said that, I am recording it, as I might well put it out on my podcast, demonstrating my humility, of course. Absolutely. That also said, I do write about myself, both in a blog, that I'll mention about that later on, and in the books. Even there, I try to limit the use of the I word. And writing fiction, which is something I do, is a particularly useful way of disguising those aspects of me which I would normally keep hidden or unspoken, but I can weave into the characters, in some of the characters and storylines. So as this somewhat private person approaches this particular event, it could be said to be one in which I'm making myself vulnerable, telling you something of my story, and being the person that I am, of course, the person who decides what the various chapters in that story will tell and what will remain hidden, either between the lines or not even reaching the margins. So I'm going to divide this kind of talk, really, this session, into chapters. So chapter 1, to talk about my employment career and some other aspects of personal life that have shaped this thing that I know as life. Chapter 2, my faith journey and how that interacts with life and church and work. And chapter 3, to talk about particularly the writing, my role as an author, and then a short epilogue at the end on perhaps some of what I've learned from this thing that we call life and faith. I thought, well, if it's okay with you, and tough if it's not, that we'll have time for questions and comments in between each chapter. So I'll have a bit of space there to talk if you want to do that. Because I think all of us, in many ways, all of us have a story to tell. And perhaps part of your programme in the future would be for each of you to say something of your own story. Some of us may feel that our story is less interesting than others or less eventful. Some of us may feel that we've encountered far too much of this thing we call life. Some of us may feel that we've not encountered enough of it to enable us to cope with what some of this thing called life demands from us. And as I talk, I hope that actually you will not focus on me, but that there might be things that are said and the various threads that I will try and weave together that you can relate to in some way and perhaps are helpful for you in some way. So, chapter 1. Now, looking around me, I can see that we are all at a particular point in life where we have more years to look back on than we do to look ahead to. So by way of background, let me just give you some significant dates in my own life. Now, you may remember 1976 for its long, hot summer, whereas I remember that period, and particularly that August, when as a teenager in that month, my mum died. And she'd been disabled for several years beforehand, but her death was an unexpected and very much a shock. And as I look back on those nearly 50 years since then, I know that I would have been quite a different person had she not died at that particular stage in my life. And yet, in many ways, her story laid a pattern for a significant part of my own life. 3 years after she died, as a low-grade civil servant, I was transferred from one government department to another one, due to government cutbacks at the time. And I was transferred into a service that provided occupational guidance for adults. So not the careers service, which focused on younger people. This was something that was available then for adults. And a week after I started in that job, I became a Christian. And I have no doubt that those two events were linked and part of God's overall purpose for me, and indeed how I then saw that play out over the next few decades. But more about that bit, more about the faith bit, in the next chapter in a bit. 6 months after I started that job, more government cutbacks came along. Now this was the 1970s, okay? A time when there was little in the way of political correctness or respect for particular groups of people. A time when, for example, disabled people were looked on as second-class citizens, and some would still argue that is still the case now, of course. But with more cutbacks came the need for a new job. I was offered one, and I refused it. Now, as a consequence of being a disobedient civil servant, I was told to go and work somewhere else. Now, in those days, it was effectively a punishment for having the temerity not to do what I was told. And I was sent to work for a centre providing employment rehabilitation courses and help for disabled people. And I loved it. I worked alongside social workers, occupational psychologists, rehabilitation specialists, technical skills instructors. I met a wonderful range of people who came to the centre for several months of rehab and pre-employment and training skills. I learned so much about a whole range of occupations and tasks and routines and jobs that people did. And that's remained a source of fascination and area of interest to me ever since. I'm fascinated by the jobs that people do. And that experience sowed the seeds not only for a career that would then last until just a few years ago, but also opened my eyes to the wonder of human beings and all that is experienced by all of us for the good and the more difficult. And that health thread, that occupational thread, has weaved its way through my life in various ways, both professionally and personally. And just to go onto the personal track just for a moment, to give you an example of that. In the late 1980s, early 90s, and a couple of times since then, including experience of long COVID, I've had 3 periods of chronic fatigue, or ME as you might have heard it called. But more about life learning from later on, and those health problems and the encounter with health problems feature in several aspects of my own family life as well. There's members of my family. So back to work for a moment. So after a period in that particular centre for about 4 years, the next lot of years went by in a variety of posts, all related to helping people to find or remain in employment. And much of it was helping people with disabilities or physical health issues or learning differences or mental health conditions which affected their ability to work. Another significant date was February 1991, when my wife Jane and I married, and then in 1993 and 1996, when our children were born. Between the two births of the children in 1994, I started a career break, and we role reversed. So I was a house husband for 5 years, and I loved that too. And it was during that period that I also began writing more about that a little bit later on. After the career break, I returned to my paid employment and in the same kind of role, and nurtured by the nature of that work, the clients I encountered, and my own experience of depression and anxiety in the years following my mum's death, I had a growing interest in the whole field of mental health and mental ill health in relation to work. And it was in the early 2000s, which was also very much was a significant time, partly nationally, and suddenly a growing awareness that we had to respond more to around mental health problems, and the government at that time was doing a lot more in relation to those. That I changed then from civil service to working still as a public servant, but this time for the NHS. And I was working in a specialist service providing information, guidance and support for people whose mental health affected their work. So people experiencing depression, anxiety, more severe and enduring conditions like schizophrenia or psychosis and drug and alcohol issues. And I found my vocation. Suddenly began to realise that this was where God had been leading me right from way back from my mum's years of disability during my childhood. I realised that this was an aspect of life that God had been forming within me for all those years, and indeed the years that then followed. That work also took on a slightly different dimension, and the service I was working for, we set up one of the very first initiatives which was specifically designed for employers in relation to mental health. So providing resources, information, training for line managers, for business owners, for HR personnel, as you might have known it, to help them support staff experiencing mental ill health. So from this small NHS service in Exeter, that initiative, which celebrated its 20th anniversary back in October, which is called Mindful Employer, it spread nationally and internationally. And I found myself speaking at conferences, being in meetings with central government personnel and experts, training managers in large, medium and small businesses and organisations across the country, and speaking at a couple of conferences abroad as well. So a final date for a moment. In December 2018, I moved on to what I call the next stage of this thing we call life. Some call it retirement. And I had the honour and privilege of being appointed MBE and receiving that from Prince William at Buckingham Palace for services to mental health. So another day to remember, and we were treated like royalty. It was an astonishing day. So that awareness of people's health and well-being has been significant in many aspects of my life, both work and family in particular. And it's shown me a lot about the value of human beings and all that human beings are and all that we go through. It's taught me to measure progress in very small ways. So often, if any of you have experienced kind of significant health issues, you know sometimes how long the kind of the treatment process might be, how long the recovery process might be. There might not be a recovery. to what we might like. How long it takes that. Sometimes actually there are no quick fixes, and sometimes it takes that length of time. So it's taught me to measure progress in very small ways, and that was true of my own experience of chronic fatigue. And to understand what life looks like from another person's perspective. There are always other views than just our own. So, before I go on to chapter 2 about the faith journey, any kind of questions or comments about what I've said already? Don't worry, if there's complete silence, that's absolutely fine. But just if there was anything that kind of comes to mind.
Richard, I was thinking while you were there talking that it must be quite a mixture of challenging and rewarding. And as your family grew up during your work, it must have been really challenging not to take those situations home with you. You just...
Yeah, I mean, it was. You know, I did. I was always grateful that I didn't work in the really, really hard end of mental health services. That I wasn't involved in treatment. I wasn't involved in assessing persons' symptoms. But even so, my job was to talk with people about their work. But inevitably, yes, I did hear stories of people who'd experienced abuse. I did hear stories of people's homelessness, or times when they've been bullied, or they've been subject to violence or crime. And those were hard to hear at times. Although I was always, in one sense, I was always quite glad if they upset me, because when you're doing that kind of work, you have to kind of toughen yourself up quite a bit. You have to protect yourself in order that you can deliver that person a good service. But sometimes I hear, gosh. And I was quite relieved for those. I thought, I haven't become a completely hard-hearted person. In terms of taking it home, that was harder in the early years, I would say. But it's sort of, I worked for the civil service, and then particularly within the NHS, that you were working in a totally confidential environment. So actually there was, you had to keep all that confidential stuff. Just occasionally I would kind of outline anonymously something that had happened if it was particularly difficult, and I just needed to talk to my wife about something that had gone on. But I knew that I had to keep things confidential. And you sort of get into that mind of thinking. And that applies to my role as a chaplain within South West Ministry Training Course. And in fact, I still treat most conversations I have now with people, I take what they say as being confidential to me, even if it wouldn't matter if it wasn't kept that way. So you sort of get into that kind of pattern. I also find that I am in a thing, so you can kind of think, you might have a conversation, you might be having a conversation with somebody, okay, and if you grade conversations between 1 and 10, all right, so 1 would be talking about Rogers to my cup of tea, or whether I wanted a biscuit or a glass of water. 10 might be the most in-depth kind of therapy, counselling type of conversations, which I might have with my own counsellor at some point, or spiritual director. I tend to enter most conversations at about 5. Which can be sometimes a little bit awkward. Because people are quite, I don't know whether I want to answer that question, Richard. So I just have to watch myself in situations like that. So you kind of, it just becomes a way of thinking, you know, and kind of, it's very easy when you're working in the kind of services that I was working in, not to look for the health problem in everybody, or not to look for the difficulties, you know. So it kind of it shapes you in particular ways. So there's a long answer to your question, but I always endeavoured not to take it home. But there were times, inevitably, if the stress of work And, you know, I, like a lot of people, I was more irritable with the children or with Jane or somebody that actually, whoops, sorry, that was nothing to do with you. That was just what's going on for me at work, for example. So, yeah, inevitably we have those times as well.
I would imagine it's quite difficult that you couldn't really offload once you got home. Then.
Yeah.
Did you have a resource that you could talk to others available within?
Yeah, I was very fortunate in particularly the last kind of 20 odd years when I was working for the NHS. We had a superb team of people around us, and we were able to, to offload to them. I had a really, really good manager, and we would have regular monthly kind of what we call supervision sessions. We'd sit down and be able to talk about particular clients and particular things that are going on. So that did release the pressure a lot of the time. And I was always grateful for particularly a couple of colleagues who would keep a watch on me. And occasionally, I remember one distinct incident where one of them, they were upstairs, I was downstairs, and the phone rang and said, they said, "Richard, could you just come upstairs a second? We just want to talk to you." And I said, "Yeah." So, okay, yeah, so I went upstairs, wondering what they were going to ask me about, if they wanted advice or whatever. And they were concerned about me. They said, "Look, just see that perhaps things aren't quite right at the moment." And they weren't. And I was so grateful times like that. Actually, people just kept a bit of a watch on me too.
Okay. The other thing I was going to say was obviously people are a lot more aware of the subject of mental health, and I would have thought a lot of people when they're seeking help at that stage had really got past the stage of they were really a severe case, whereas I think today people are a lot more aware of mental health, and it's become a lot more common words to use, and checking on people, and so I would think that now there's probably even more demand for that service.
Yes,
people are probably coming a lot earlier with issues.
One would like to think so. I think one would like to think that people are asking for help more quickly than they used to, and I think there is less shame about it. There's more recognition that we all go through difficult times, and some of that is a normal experience of this thing we call life. But there are times when it begins to have a bigger or more longer standing impact that actually we need to ask for that help. But I think, that 2010 was a great time for this gradual increasing awareness that actually we need to talk about mental health, and the differences between mental health and mental ill health as well, because it's important that we all kind of look after our mental well-being, but also recognise those times when perhaps things like depression or anxiety begin to affect us more than is healthy, really. It has been good to see that develop, and to see that change. And I had the privilege of being part of that period when that was taking shape. Because I think there's a lot of feeling still. I think it's probably. I'm hoping that within churches the attitudes have improved, but there's still a lot of feeling that actually, if you're experiencing kind of a mental health difficulty, that you're somehow weak, that you're somehow or that where's your faith? Are you not trusting Jesus in kind of this situation? And I hope that we're moving past that kind of limiting Jesus to what is possible, and understanding our lives, and understanding that Jesus himself had periods of anxiety. Jesus himself took himself off to places to kind of have that time praying to God. And you think, there must be elements there of looking after himself within that. So hopefully, I think there's an increasing understanding all round.
Without being sexist, did you find when you first started that it seemed easier for women to talk about all mental health problems and things? Because men were always taught, stick up a bit.
Yeah.
And has it changed since you've been in that?
Yeah, I think, I don't know about areas of change. My guess would be is that women do tend to talk more openly because, generally speaking, women have better social and friendship networks than men do. And I think there is something within men which is part of this kind of stiff upper lip thing. We've got to be seen to be strong. We can't admit to weaknesses. But I think it has changed for men. I think I've seen the change in men. So probably in answer to your question, there has been a gender change, that actually men are more capable, more able, and more willing to actually come out and say, you know what, I've had these problems too, and the relief actually sometimes in them when they realise that the person they've just told has also had those difficulties, or if somebody's in a meeting like this, for example, talking about it, think, oh right, it wasn't just me, it wasn't my fault, it wasn't me being weak, So I think, yeah, probably the male side I would like to think has improved a lot.
Yeah, from my perspective, as
Yeah.
people,
Yeah.
Men do seem a bit more comfortable.
Yeah, no, that's right.
There's a lot more publicity.
Yeah.
And it's okay not to be okay.
Yes.
It's all right for men to cry, and
Yeah,
then there's a lot more of like celebrities.
Yeah.
And their stories,
Mm.
and then that will touch onto other people and think, oh well, I've been going through that. And
Yeah.
I didn't realise such and such was.
Yeah.
Well, that's the same. And
yeah. No, that's right. That's right. Yeah.
having those role models who have
Yeah.
had these issues, etc.
Yeah. I mean, take Freddie Flintoff, for example. His experience following that Top Gear crash. That he's been speaking openly about what that did to him, and he didn't go out of the house for 6 months. And just being those kind of people in the public eye. I think, oh right, okay. I thought here you were, this kind of super cricketer, macho man, drinker. Those kind of all those things which might be stereotypically masculine. That actually this can happen as well, but they're more just within our congregations and personal contacts. But I think male isolation is still an issue for many, men who don't have that much in the way of personal, close friends, people who they feel they can be open with. Okay, let's move on. So, chapter 2, the faith story. I became a Christian in a red light area. So my mum had been a Christian. She took me to church and enabled me to go to Sunday school. And that provided a very good grounding and an awareness of the various stories that Jesus told and the miracles that he performed. But at the age of 11, I decided that I didn't believe in any of it, that it was a fairy story, just like the other ones that I gained an awareness of in those early childhood years. So during the following years of teenage adolescence and believing that I knew everything, as teenage people tend to do, I became quite against faith, particularly the figure of Jesus. And the sixth form common room, for example, was often, discussions were often quite heated at the time. But it was during those teenage years, as you recall I mentioned earlier, that my mum died. And that got me thinking about whether there was something, whether there was some being or force that existed that watched over our lives or our world or what we did. And I don't know if you ever came across the books by an author called Eric von Daniken. And he wrote a series of books based around the principle that God was an astronaut, that there's somehow this extraterrestrial being that oversaw everything that was happening on Earth. I read those. Another period of such searching saw me considering joining the Communist Party, or being a vegetarian, or other ways of trying to find meaning in life. But it was then in 1979 that I had the most, at the time, ridiculous thought. I was sat in my flat in the St Paul's area of Bristol, which is, if you know Bristol, it's a well-known, vibrant, multiracial area, and it has a rather unconventional street nightlife. And I was sat in my flat and I looked at the Gideon New Testament that I'd been given at school a few years previously. And within a Gideon New Testament, they have various subjects, and under those subjects it gives you particular verse references. And I began to look at those. And I began to experience something that I had never experienced before. And I then remembered one person from school, not a student, but the school librarian. I knew one person who went to church, just like you were saying when we came in. He was now retired, but he maintained contact with me after I'd left school. So I phoned him and asked him if I could go to his church. I think back now as to how that delightful American and his delightful wife would have rejoiced in that call. What an answer that would have been to their prayers, I am sure. So I went along, and during the next couple of months I gradually began the process of learning what this faith and church business was about. I joined a group that was led by the vicar, kind of a Christian basics type of course, to find out more about the basics of the Christian faith. But my sticking point, though, remained with Jesus, and in particular, the resurrection. Now, you remember my mentioning of starting that first job in occupational guidance in October 79? Well, it was a week or so later that I was walking home from one of those Christian basic sessions along the renowned city road, past the Ladies of the Night. And it was just gone 10 p.m. And I thought, so if this Jesus was the Son of God, then why not come back to life? And that was it. I knew, I believed. That was the moment I thought, yes, this is what it is. This is something I can believe in. As the years followed, I was at a large evangelical church. I became involved in many things, in children's work, a group for those aged 20s and 30s, PCCs, ecumenical activities in the city, to living in a flat at the top of the vicarage. Lived there for 5 years and seeing all that went on in the day and the night in a clergy household. This was in another bit of Bristol now. And eventually in 1987 I moved back home to Devon, and another large evangelical church. Another set of involvements of different types followed in those years. But the best thing was meeting Jane and the subsequent birth of our 2 children. And as the 1990s went on, church-wise, it became a different story. It became Sunday mornings at the same church, evensong at the cathedral. I was becoming disenchanted with some of the evangelical church's messaging, particularly its emphasis on sin and its rather clear-cut right-wrong approach to many aspects of this thing we call life. A thing we call life, which I was learning was actually far more complex than some of the messaging that was being given out. So God was moving me in a different way and to a different and deeper place. I began seeing a spiritual director and discovering the blessings of stillness, of silence, of contemplative forms of prayer. Then my wife Jane got a new job. This was in the time we'd role reversed, and we moved to a different part of the country for a couple of years, and that took us to a different kind of church tradition. But then when we returned to Devon, we then went to an Anglo-Catholic church, and I continued training as a licensed lay minister or reader as some of you will know it. So that calling, if you like, as a reader, although I've never really viewed it that way, apart from in retrospect, that role as a reader brought together all the experiences that God had enabled me to have. It provided a more formal structure in some ways, and a tacit approval by the church to be able to be in a particular role, to undertake licensed lay ministry, which I've done now for well over 20 years. I personally have never felt called to ordination. In 2012, though, my wife was called to ordination. She was an English teacher up until that point, and she trained with Southwest Ministry training course, and in 2015 she was ordained, and she began work as a curate in the South Hams area of Devon, in the Totnes area. So began a life of living in a vicarage, and me being a clergy husband. 4 years after that, as is traditional with curates, as you know, Jane then moved on. She took up a post as a team vicar. 6 months in to that new post, the team rector announced that he was leaving due to ill health, and Jane took 6 churches through a year-long vacancy and the pandemic, that same period. I, by now retired from employment, I took a particular lead in making online services, and what a joy and a blessing those were in such a difficult time in many ways. Then 2 years ago, for various reasons that I won't go into, Jane took up a new post, a part-time one, where she is in many ways a traditional parish priest. And we now live in the village of Malden, which is near Paynton, on the Totnes team of 10 churches. So I'm a lay minister there as well, still as a licensed lay minister. And in these last few years, just finished my 4th year, I've also taken up this role as a voluntary chaplain with SWMTC, Southwest Ministry Training College, supporting people training for lay and ordained ministry, and others who want to study theology, and that's what Steve has been involved and been training with as well. And that role, in many ways, as a chaplain, pulled together the different threads from my work, from my personal life, from being a clergy husband, to somebody who myself, I failed A-levels at school, but I then went to university when I was about 50, as part-time, did an MSc. So I was studying as an adult, which a lot of the students at SWMTC are doing alongside work. Mental health background, being a licensed lay minister, brought all those experiences together, and that's been a real joy being in that position. And I'm also now involved in supporting other people who live this rather peculiar life of living in a vicarage or other forms of clergy households. Suddenly, where your home is not your own, and you become somewhat public property when you're in kind of a licensed ministry. And that was another thread that began back in those Bristol days when I spent 5 years living in a flat at the top of a very big, busy vicarage. And that gave me a lifelong concern for those in church ministry and all the joys and difficulties that role carries with it. Nevertheless, or perhaps as a result, I have a somewhat complex relationship with the church, with a capital C. Thankfully, I learnt very early on, in those very early stages of faith, that our faith has to be based on God and not on the church and the people within it. What we see in the church is an imperfect and incomplete image of God's love and provision. And like many, I've been loved and supported by people in that church. Like many, I've been criticised and hurt by people in that church. But yes, of course, the church, and I'm talking with a capital C here, not particularly identifying one particular group. The church obviously has a role in providing a very valuable community of believers. But we do need to be careful, I feel, not to devote ourselves to churchianity when we end up not doing Christianity. That we end up being so good at doing church, we don't do God in our day-to-day lives. I still very much value my evangelical roots, but I've moved on to a different, and for me personally, more enriching place of encounter with God. So finally, to end this chapter, I want to take you back 10 years. In those early months after Jane's ordination, really when God did call me to a further experience and deepening of that journey of faith. So 2015 had been a year of enormous change. Our son had moved house, our daughter had finished college and left home to do a gap year. My wife had been ordained and our home was now a vicarage. I was now working part-time, preparing for a big life change. So my worldview had become blurred. Where did all that change leave me? Well, it was a work trip that actually provided an unexpected answer. The hotel room in Surrey, I remember it, Camberley I think it was, the hotel room was quiet and I sat reading about Jesus' encounter with Bartimaeus. I'd read it before. I'd led Bible studies on it. I'd preached on it. But this time, it was different. This time, just like with Bartimaeus, it was me who was being asked the question. What do you want me to do for you? Said Jesus. My eyes just kind of opened wide as those words leapt off the page. It was as if I regained my sight. Who, me? Jesus asking me? As after years of living in somewhat of a spiritual desert, with doubts and uncertainties, I did know what I wanted Jesus to do. And during the next few months, I followed Jesus into that deeper place. He opened my eyes more to the depths of quiet, contemplative prayer. He led me to a source of church community which wasn't in the local parishes. And that was in becoming a lay member of a Benedictine monastic community. First of all, at the now closed Alton Abbey in Hampshire, and now at Mucknell Abbey in Worcestershire, where I'm going to be next week on retreat. And that aspect of Benedictine spirituality, if you don't know, forms itself around three principles. Listening to God, conversion of life and faith, or change as I like to think of it, and stability. For as we listen to God, we become increasingly aware that in order to change and to cope with change, stability is needed. But in order to be stable in our lives, we also need to change. What do you want me to do for you? Asks Jesus. Asks each one of us that question. And he longs to hear our answers. Any other kind of questions or comments, or thoughts, observations at that point before I go on to talk about the writing?
With your reader ministry training, what type of calling sense did you get to take that on, and how difficult did you find the training for that?
Okay. So, So the answer that I never gave them when I was interviewed for it was that I didn't feel called.
It's only in retrospect that I can see that God has somehow used that and took me into that ministry. At the time, and this is going back 25 years ago now, at the time I felt that God was saying going into some kind of lay ministry, but I didn't know what that looked like. I spent a bit of time looking at, well, could that be in a kind of an administrative role or other things, and thought about a couple of other areas. But over the preceding years, I gained quite a lot of experience in different aspects of church life. And I felt, I knew by then that, I was okay good at public speaking. And I thought, I'd like to do something like that. So in many ways, I saw actually training as a reader to be a way of kind of putting a wrapper around all those individual bits of experience. So in many respects, I used that possibility of a way of actually encapsulating all those things, enabling me to do more in a kind of an authorised way. The training I did, actually, we were living in Cambridgeshire for that couple of years when I started. So that was Diocese of Ely. And the training there, and it was the case when we moved back to Devon, Diocese of Exeter, the training was done in small groups. There wasn't an organisation like SWMTC. SWMTC was different at that point when we were in Exeter at that time. So I go to a kind of evening classes or Saturday classes. Groups of people also going through their training, have a personal tutor, and that kind of structure, and assignments and things like that. And it was at a point where, I'm trying to think, that was the children. By then, my daughter must have been about 4 or 5. The children were still quite young, but they were also meant that they were going to bed at a reasonable time to allow some of the evenings still to be left. So I kind of fitted in the kind of the assignment side of things. I don't think it was as demanding as what is currently delivered to licensed lay ministers. We had good talks and good sessions and things like that. But I think as I look now at it, as to how it's structured now, I would say it's more demanding now. But it was good. It gave me a good basis for what I then went on to do.
You get quite within your role at South West Ministry Training College as a chaplain. Do you find that quite rewarding to see how the students progress through the years and where they are in year one? And
Yeah, totally. In fact, this last weekend, so just yesterday, Saturday and Sunday, was the final weekend of the academic year. So we had people who come there are from Devon and Cornwall, Exeter Diocese. And so yesterday, we said goodbye to 6 people who will be ordained at the end of this month, and 8 people who will be licensed as lay ministers over the forthcoming months. And certainly, or to see all of them go through a journey, and to have at various points had conversations with them about how things were going, some of the difficulties that they'd encountered, and how they got to the end of the course. And particularly, a couple of people, one particular person, I remember on their very first weekend and their second weekend as well, in tears, thinking, I can't possibly do this. I can't possibly cope with this. How am I going to do all this, And then to see them, and I said to them yesterday, you did it. You got through it, and they could see. It's that progress thing. It's seeing people make progress, and people who come into it not feeling very confident about it at all. Others who come in, shall we say, uber confident. Oh yes, I'm going to be the best minister there is in the whole of the Church of England, and seeing that just taken down a little bit. and obviously it's a front. It's often covering up their own kind of confidence and things. But seeing those changes take place and people actually beginning to realise that actually this isn't about me ministry. This is about God's ministry. It's about kind of actually how can God use you in particular ways and for his church and his people. So it is wonderful to see people make progress and go on. And the farewell service we had yesterday, there was the usual amount of tears. People are kind of what a big achievement, but also, gosh, I'm going to have to do it now. Move on to chapter 3. Steve very kindly said that I could bring along the various books that I've written. So a little bit about each of those and about being an author. So I wrote my first book about the link between faith and work back in the early 1990s. And it was accepted for publication twice, but in both cases the publisher encountered financial difficulties, so they were unable to proceed. So that book's never seen the light of day as an entity. After that, some people suggested that I wrote articles. So I took that route for a number of years, including interviewing several well-known people. So Terry Waite, John Major, former Prime Minister, Nick Park, the animator, the man behind Wallace and Gromit, and local people in the news or features for magazines. Also wrote press releases for local churches and organisations, Bible study notes for Scripture Union, and book reviews, which I still do now. And then just before I retired in 2018, I started writing a blog at Work.Rest.Pray.com, Work.Rest.Pray.com. And that was really a way of not completely losing all the experiences and insights that God had granted me over the years, in the hope that they will be helpful to people in their own lives. I didn't want it to be about me, but I was able to, I felt it would be helpful to use some of the things that I'd observed or encountered as helpful for other people. So a new post is available about every couple of weeks. I put a new one out, and in the last few months I've developed a podcast, which is an audio version of each post, and the recording from tonight, hopefully if it's come out all right, we'll go onto that podcast with a link from the blog. So non-fiction wise, I write fiction and non-fiction. Non-fiction wise, I write books that are related to the Christian faith, in particularly books which explore how we can live a more faith-enriched and perhaps sometimes faith-challenged life in a kind of 21st century society which has largely turned away from the established church. So the first book, Story to Tell, and that explores what we might learn from people who met Jesus. So often we focus on Jesus, on what Jesus tells us, but you just think about how many people met Jesus and what a story they would have to tell. So people like Mary Magdalene, or Nicodemus, the woman of Samaria, Judas Iscariot, what stories they would have to tell. So this book speculates and reflects. It's not a commentary, it's not meant to be theologically accurate, on some of those characters, some of those people, and considers quite a wide range of issues, such as healing and wholeness, devotion, having doubts, then think about Thomas, waiting, finding, betrayal, and love, and other aspects. That was a book that I kind of self-published, put together myself. And in the back of it, there's some group discussion material as well. It's photocopiable. Life with St. Benedict is a book published by BRF that you might well have heard of. And that provides daily reflections on the rule of St. Benedict. So I mentioned about this Benedictine monastic community. And they kind of live according to the rule that St. Benedict wrote back in the 6th century. And that rule still retains a tremendous relevance for the 21st century. You know, a time when often change is feared and kind of stability can be quite elusive. And this book really is an aid to kind of our spiritual growth and prayer. And often I think speaks to it in a time where we're living where a lot of people are seeking space and silence and spiritual depth. And it offers a section from the rule for each day, together with a reflection, short reflection for modern living. And it's over 4 months. So you could, if you want to, use it 3 times in the course of the year. Each entry is dated. And then finding stability in times of change builds on aspects of that Benedictine spirituality that I talked about earlier, and builds a little bit on life with St. Benedict. So that the book takes the miracle of the calming of the storm, the one when Jesus is asleep in the boat, and it reflects on how we cope with, or perhaps don't cope with, change or other things that life, the storm of life, throws at us. And you know, as we all know, change is nothing new. You know, it's ever present, and often change is faster than many people can cope with. So that's, as the title suggests, really, it says what it says on the cover, really, finding stability in times of change. And then I've got a new book coming out later in the year called Loving Yourself. So you shall love your neighbour as yourself, one of Jesus' most well-known sayings. And probably most of us feel quite comfortable with the love your neighbour part. You're thinking of others, being kind to other people, even if we don't like them that much. But what about as yourself? To have love for ourselves in the same way that we love others. A bit more tricky, that one. So loving yourself will explore how our love for both our neighbour and ourselves stems from God's love for us. Considers the kind of the background and the context of Jesus' words, what it means and what it doesn't mean to have love for ourselves, and how we can love ourselves in a way that then enables us to love our neighbour, and how all that love comes from God. So some very practical suggestions within the book, and it wrestles with some of the trickier aspects of that as well. Fiction-wise, I write contemporary novellas, and fiction is very much another story, really, in terms of writing. It was a lockdown surprise. In that time, I started reading more novels, and then out of the blue got an idea for what became the beginning of the first Eastwood Story novella. And there are a series of 3 books which explore different aspects of everyday life for the kind of the central and other characters. They're stories of love and loss, of laughter and tears, of conflict and resolution. Stories of hope over adversity, all with a happy ending. And they draw a lot on my professional and personal experience of what I've seen and encountered in other people, and how we deal with what life brings, as well as lessons from my own life. And just to go through them quickly, the first story, called Looking to Move On, introduces Matt West, who's the central character of the book. And he, as a result of a car accident, now uses a wheelchair. And it was an event that saw the loss of his wife, Jo. And that story begins by exploring all that came with that, and his ongoing life with Tilly, their young daughter. And among other characters, the story introduces Sophie Howlett, a community nurse who supported Matt in his own rehabilitation. And as time goes on, their friendship and love grows, and spoiler alert, the book ends on the weekend of their wedding. The second book in the series, so I was going to mention that actually. This book kind of contains very little that I've not experienced or witnessed, but it's all heavily disguised. as I kind of alluded to really. You know when you read in a book when it says that any resemblance to actual persons is living or dead is coincidental. Well, of course, that's absolute rubbish. Every author draws on what they see going on around them. We just don't say who it is. The second book, called Living the Difference, starts on the same weekend that one finished. While Matt, Sophie and Tilly are very much in the story, I shifted the focus onto some other characters from the first one, including the local vicar. If you want some insights into vicarage life, there you are. But also some of the town's other residents. So Eastwood Minster is a fictitious town, but that's where they're set. And then the third book, which is called Hopes and Expectations, that was published just back in March, and that continues the West story, and other people feature in it too. Now, although they're written as a series, they can be read in any order. There's enough backstory without you needing necessarily to have read the previous one. But I hope you'll notice a bit of a similarity in the titles. So Looking to Move On, Living the Difference, Hopes and Expectations. These are stories of hope over adversity. They're stories partly written with the reader in mind as to how best you can relate your experiences. And I think it's helpful sometimes to reflect on our own lives in relation to fiction. And of course, poets and novelists have done that for years. So my hope, and perhaps my expectation, is that you might buy some of it. Some are on special offer too as well. And I can take card. But above all, whether reading one of the novellas or one of the faith-related books, I hope that people will find words that they can relate their own life to. And that's my primary aim in writing, is to write things that people can think, yeah, actually, I can relate to that. Yeah, that helps me understand part of my life a bit better. Hopefully they'll enjoy it as a piece of writing as well. Yeah. So, before I finish off with an epilogue, any questions or thoughts or comments on the books, or the writing side of things?
Which do you get the biggest buzz out of, the fiction or the non-fiction?
That's a good question. They're quite different things to write. I think with the non-fiction, that is done in a more of a planned way, and I think, right, okay, this is how I'll do it, this is how I'll explore the subject of the book. But to see that coming together, and I love the editing process when you write it down first and then go back over and over again, changing it. So there's a lot of satisfaction about producing a good book that hopefully is not only factually accurate, but is one that people will benefit from in terms of deepening their faith. Writing fiction is quite a different animal. Initially, I don't know where it came from initially. Well, I do. In some way, God inspired me, and the kind of the very beginning of the very first fiction book, I had the opening paragraph was in my head for a couple of weeks, and I thought, what's going on here? So I thought, well, in the end, I'll write it down. And then I went back to it, and I wrote the next bit, and then I wrote the next bit. I thought, and it just takes on a life of its own, really. And it is true what people say, that sometimes you find, this character's just done this, or they've just said this ridiculous thing. So they very much take on a life of their own. So that's a very exciting progress. You kind of see that more creative side coming out. Think, oh, that looks good. That's good too. And of course, in a work of fiction, you can essentially write what you want. I have, in the course of the story, there is one particular situation within the book that I have dug myself into a hole with, and I don't know how to take it on from there. But I thought, well, that's part of it as well. Thinking, what do I do with this one now? I mean, you can always go back and rewrite it or whatever, but sometimes you get that wrestling in a different way than you do perhaps with the more kind of faith side of things, fiction works. But
when you're doing these books, do you sort of sit down initially and you would say set out a bit of a plan, or do you simply say, right, these are the names of my principal characters? I know some authors, they walk around a graveyard and they pick up names off tombstones.
Yeah.
And once they've got the characters and they get into the first chapter, see, they've got nothing to do other than sit there and type, because the characters that they've chosen tell them what to put on the page.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the other thing I was going to ask, do you say, right, there's 5 working days in the week, each day I shall do so many words between, shall we say, 9 o'clock and 12 o'clock. Do you have any sort of figures on that, as it were? Or?
Not the second bit, no, it's all fairly random. And invariably it depends partly on what else is going on. To a certain extent I have to feel in the mood to do it. But it also depends what ideas have been coming up. So if, like, the equivalent of walking around the graveyard, I'll be walking the dog, or in the middle of the night, I suddenly thought, oh yes, that would be a good thing to include. I will make a note of that, or I'll write it down.
So in the middle of the night you would get up and make...
No, I wouldn't get up in the middle of the night and do it, but I'd hope that if that I have a principle really, if in the middle of the night there's a thought or thinking, oh yeah, that would be good. If that's still there by the morning, I think that might be worth hanging on to. So I'd write it down. But no, I don't write in a structured way in sense of putting aside time. I do in terms of any planning that takes place, yes, with the faith books, there's more planning. But with the fiction ones, it's more what you were saying there about, suddenly it starts writing itself. And suddenly you have these characters that develop and you think, oh yeah, that could do that. Well, suddenly you find yourself writing something, as I said earlier, about, gosh, they've just done that. The inspiration from graveyards or other places of getting a character's name can sometimes come about through different things. A character, the situation that a character finds themselves in, can often spring from something. So I've actually literally just started writing the 4th book in this series, and that will be quite random to begin with. I will probably write little bits, almost kind of sometimes individual scenes or individual chapters, and then put them together as it goes on. And one thing that's come into one of those very early chapters is based on a radio interview I heard a couple of weeks ago, when the journalist was interviewing somebody about their particular involvement in an initiative. And I thought, actually, that ties in. I could make that tie in with some of what was the main storylines in there. So you kind of get those little kind of prompts and other stuff that are a springport for further stories.
Do you know if your wife or your children have read any of your books?
Yeah, no.
Comment?
Yeah, no, they do. Yes, no, I think so. In terms of they tend to read them after publication, it has to be said. Occasionally I have shown bits to Jane, particularly beforehand. I do show, particularly the fiction ones. I have a couple of people who read stuff through for me with those, who are friends, or some people actually I only really know them virtually, by email or whatever, other writers. And they will comment, which is helpful. And yeah, it's always nice when they have read them, and generally they're positive after the event. It's a bit late then, in some respects, if they don't like it. But no, they're very supportive in that way, in what I write, and encourage me within it. But I think it's an incredibly crowded market out there, and as somebody who, like many authors, the vast majority of authors do not sell many copies. There's very few who are in that kind of best-selling author type of category. Very few who kind of got their books on the shelves of major bookshops. So
I, like others, you have to learn to actually focus on the good comments you get back. You know, somebody just actually at the weekend, one of the other SWMTC students has just finished reading the first two of the novellas and got the third one from me at the weekend, and she said that she found the characters really relatable too. I thought, yes, that's what I like. That's what makes it worthwhile. And if they only sell 100 or 200 copies, okay, but it's when you have the nice comments. It's when somebody puts a review on Amazon or Goodreads and writes a nice thing about it. It's kind of that makes it worthwhile.
Well, I look forward to hearing a good read then on Radio 4.
Well, I doubt it'll ever get to there, but...
Well, they do 3 at a time, don't they?
I don't know, right, do they?
You've missed out on that.
I have, yeah. Oh, you have to recommend me, please.
Well, from time to time they put a few on. They're very late at night.
Right.
Probably 11 o'clock on.
Yeah, no, I have heard of the programme. I mean, a lovely thing that does take place. I've been on BBC Radio Devon a couple of times because the BBC. You may have heard of BBC Introducing, which is a platform for musicians, but they also have. I've forgotten the name of it. It's a similar initiative for authors. And basically you can record kind of 2 minutes of your writing and send it to your local radio station. And then they'll link that in with an interview, have a chat with them over the phone. That's been a really good thing that they're doing there, just to kind of highlight local people who are trying to do things. I've been on a couple of other local radio stations with both types of the books, actually, on the Radio Devon, where Radio Devon and Cornwall, of course, do a lot of work together now. So their Sunday morning breakfast / faith programme, been on there a few times over the years. And so there's different outlets there, but you never really know what people think. But it is lovely when people give you a nice comment or say that they found it really enjoyable or interesting or useful to them in their own life.
So do you or your family feature as any of the characters?
They're heavily disguised. There's
have they recognised it? Obviously, it's not yourself, but have they recognised it when they've read it?
So my wife recognised situations that I'd alluded to. So particularly in the second book, that one, when there's quite a lot about vicars and vicarages and things like that. I said, oh yeah, see where that was coming from. And I met a former work colleague of mine a few weeks ago, and she'd expressed an interest in them as well. I said, well, if you read that one, because there's quite a lot in there about work and people encountering difficult work situations. So I said, you recognise the general kind of allusions. You won't recognise. Nobody will recognise a specific incident in a specific place regarding a specific person. So in that case, it's that's very deliberate. There's certainly elements of me in Matt, the central character, but not all of him. And there's elements of my story in some of the storyline. But again, you wouldn't be able to pick out what that was. So don't read that and think, oh, Richard's been up to a lot, hasn't he? But it's great, and I think one of the things that was a lovely surprise, and sort of it alludes a little bit to the point you were kind of heading towards, is when I got to the end of writing this book, I thought I'd really like to meet them. You become in that point where actually you were almost living with them, that they were becoming real people. And I said, oh, no, I can't. So that's nice as a writer to have that creative side of things.
So how long does it actually take you? What's the longest and the shortest time it's taken you to write one of the books?
That varies quite a bit. Once I get going, I can write quite quickly. Getting going is sometimes...
Reading the book, I expect, as well. Sometimes you've got that big bucket of
Yeah, it depends. Yeah, like reading your book, it depends on how much it grabs you, and sometimes you can sit down and read this big novel over a weekend if it really kind of grabs you. Other times, this is a much more of an effort. Sometimes it comes together in bits, so I might write little bits. So that book, to a certain extent, I wrote that as kind of a few almost like short stories to begin with, and then I managed to weave them together. With the faith books, I write a lot in my head, so quite a lot of that. I mean, half of that is somebody else's words. Half of that is directly from the Rule of St. Benedict. Because each section begins with some text from the Rule of St. Benedict, and then there's a short reflection by me. So that one, I remember writing quite a lot of this when I was on retreat at Alton Abbey in Hampshire. And I'd perhaps take myself off for a walk, mulling over the particular bit of the rule. And think, oh yeah, do that with that, and then go back and actually write it down. Because the kind of the editing process, you don't know quite how long that's going to take. So going back over it and thinking, is that the right phrase? Am I making the right point here? That can vary in length. That's a longer process, I find, with fiction, because to a certain extent you've got to make sure that what you've just said about one character having blue eyes, that they didn't have brown eyes earlier on in the story. Or I found actually what I did do was that I gave two characters the same surname without realising it. So when I then came to, I think it was this book, I realised that I'd done that in this book. So I then had to make up a way of actually how do I explain that. And so, just said so-and-so and so-and-so, no relation. So yeah, it varies a lot. It does depend on how the ideas come and the phrasing and putting aside the time, whether that's in a deliberate way or actually you're right, I need to actually get on with this. But once I actually start writing, that the actual act of putting it onto the laptop comes along relatively quickly. And the other bit of writing, the blog I mentioned, that one has a bit more discipline to it in that I kind of make myself put a new post out about every 2 weeks. And those, they're usually 500 or 600 words. And I've written those from initial spark to completed thing within the day. Other times it might be over a few days. The books tend to take obviously over a few months. But I'm fortunate. I'm not under contract to deliver by certain timescales. And the new book, for example, that is coming up, that started life in a different way. That started life as a talk I gave about loving yourself at Exeter Cathedral, actually, an evening service they had there. And that just sat as a talk on my laptop for a good year, 18 months. I thought, actually, this could develop into something else. And then I started writing up, so I had the basis of my script, and then started adding more to it, and that kind of developed from there. And the particular publisher that's accepted that they are turning it round a bit more quickly than a couple of the other ones, but that's fine, because you then got the backwards and forwards with the publisher. And they're perhaps making comments about it, kind of revising it further. But yeah, it's a great creative process. So I go back to your original question. Was I enjoy writing in many ways. That's my happy place, really, or one of them.
I think you can tell when you started doing this evening, when you started talking about your books.
Yeah.
Tell the excitement.
So yeah, no, it does come. Yeah, it does come through with that, which is nice. Yeah, thank you.
Do you write in Word or one or the other?
In Word, yes, yeah, I find that does the job. That does the job well.
It's good for spelling, isn't it?
It is good for spelling.
For spelling.
Yeah. I write on this a bit if I get an idea And I thought, actually, I need to capture that. Then I'll just type an email to myself and write in bits so I don't lose it. Sometimes it's scraps of paper. And then, so my desk where I write at home has kind of got little scraps of paper with little quotes from other people on it, or something I've suddenly thought of and thought, always mustn't lose that. And so, yeah.
Post-it notes, isn't it?
And post-it notes is obviously useful as well. So yes, no, that has been known. That has been known. Yeah. Good.
I think what Steve's been on about wanting to ask you is, will we feature in the next book?
Well, that's given me a good idea. Actually, I can work on that idea. So, finally, an epilogue. So, I mean, as I look back on this, many things really, I reflect on this thing that we call life. Is that life is for learning. It's one of the things that I think has stayed with me for many, many years. Not just necessarily in a practical sense, in kind of qualifications or skills or hobbies, but in what we learn about other people and what we learn about ourselves and about God. I'm a great one for drawing parallels. So parallels between events and instances, perhaps. And that often relates itself to God. So what did I learn from that past time in life that could help with the present time? How did God show his or her presence then, might show now? How was God faithful in such times? And all that, I think, helps build up our trust in God. Knowing God is faithful to us and will be close to us in even the most difficult circumstances we encounter, and even in those times when we don't perhaps feel that closeness. So I want to share just a couple of different verses from different parts of the Bible that have spoken to me over the years. Firstly, you'll be familiar with these verses, I'm sure. Words from Isaiah 40. They first became important to me in my first period of ME, chronic fatigue, and they've remained a prominent reminder of God's love and strength over the years. Isaiah 40, verses 28 to 31. Have you not known? Have you not heard? The Lord is an everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not faint or grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable. He gives power to the faint and strengthens the powerless. Even youths will faint and be weary, and the young will fall exhausted. But those who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. So I think we can live this thing we call life in the knowledge and comfort of God's strength, even when we feel weary and worn out and faint. God the Lord will give us power and the strength to enable us to rise on wings like eagles. And it's in that knowledge that I start every day with some words from Psalm 25. Sat on the edge of my bed, I say often quietly to myself, Psalm 25, verse 1. To you, O Lord, I lift up my soul. O my God, in you I trust. And not only every day, but often at other times, sat in the car just before I came in this evening. To you, O Lord, I lift up my soul. O my God, in you I trust. Finally, another verse that's been part of my faith since those very early days after that conversion experience on that road in Bristol. Matthew 6, verse 6. Whenever you pray, go into your room and shut the door and pray to your Father who is in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you. And it's particularly for me, it's that last bit. Your Father who sees in secret. That is sufficient. That is all we need. And that actually ties in with some words from the rule of St. Benedict. Place your hope in God alone. If you notice something good in yourself, give credit to God, not to yourself. So this thing we call life is not for me about blowing our own trumpet or getting recognition. It's not about talking about ourselves for an hour and a half one Monday evening. It is sufficient for God to know who we are, what we do, and for God to be given the credit, the glory for what is good, and to be held firmly by God's faithfulness, trust, and strength in whatever we experience. Thank you for listening and for being here.
Can I just ask what chapter 4 might hold for you?
What, chapter 4?
Might hold for you.
Oh.
What do you think the future might hold?
Gosh.
Is there something that you feel you really want to do?
Well, that's a very good question. I was not anticipating that one, but thank you for asking it. At the moment, I think in many respects it's to carry on as things are at this time. To a certain extent, there was a bit of a sea change, bit of a change of things a couple of years ago. Partly that the chaplaincy role came out partly out of that, and the writing has developed. I can see doing more writing, doing the chaplaincy role. Part of my I mentioned about having a vocation in an employment sense. I think we all have different vocations at times, and my other vocations being as a husband and a dad. And there's a degree of ongoing support that I can provide within family life. So I think that will continue. At the moment, I don't envisage taking on anything extra or new, but just to kind of let's just see how we go. But if you never know. That's right. And it's remaining open to that. But I'm also quite content that actually at the moment I'm doing what I think God wants me to do at the moment and for the foreseeable future. We'll see. But thank you for the question. That was a good one to ask. It's a good one to ask.
Better changes.
Yes, quite possibly.
It does, doesn't it?
It does.
You don't plan.
It does. You don't know what.
Something will
That's right.
suddenly trigger it.
Yeah. No, that's right. And as I look back over the last couple of years, there have been things that have happened that have changed the way of you. Yeah. No, that's right. And it changes it in ways that you don't expect. But sometimes I think there is a value in maintaining stability within those changes as well. So it may be to a certain extent that I'm part of the stability for changes that are affecting other people that I know and love. So yeah, thank you.
I know within the chaplaincy course I've just finished, one of the questions that we got asked towards the end of the day was, where do you see yourself in 5 years' time? And my answer was, that's not for me to decide.
No.
I said, if you've got a plan, that's when God's up there laughing at you.
Yeah.
And like, little do you know.
Yeah, no, that's right. Yeah.
Any more questions, gentlemen? Well, thank you very much for coming to talk to us this evening, Richard.
Thank you. Thank you. No, it's been good to come along.
Very,
Thank
very
you.
interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Good. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed.